The sacred oak grove is burning, as Roman soldiers torch the ancient trees where your people have worshipped for 1,000 years. You clutch the carved staff that marks you as a druid, a keeper of secrets that Caesar's legions would kill to possess. The year is 60 AD, and everything you've ever known is about to disappear forever. But you won't disappear with it tonight. You'll discover how the last guardians of Celtic wisdom survived the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and how they kept their sacred knowledge alive in the shadows of Roman civilization. The smoke stings your eyes as you watch centuries of sacred tradition reduced to ash and ember. The ancient oaks of Mona, what the Romans call Anglesey, have stood sentinel over Celtic ritual and learning for time beyond memory. Each tree was more than timber. They were living libraries, their bark carved with Ogham script that recorded genealogies, laws, and sacred formulae that took Druids decades to memorize. You are Brenos, named for the legendary chieftain who sacked Rome itself 3 centuries ago. The name was a gift from your teacher, Cathbad the Wise, who saw in your young mind the spark of defiance that would be needed in dark times ahead. Now, as you crouch in the bracken watching Roman torches consume your world, that defiance is all that stands between survival and extinction. The Romans came at dawn, their scarlet cloaks like spilled blood against the winter landscape. Suetonius Paulinus himself led the assault, the governor whose name had become synonymous with Celtic suffering across Britain. His legions crossed the treacherous waters of the Menai Strait on specially constructed rafts, their shields locked in formation, their javelins glinting in the pale morning light. The Druids who tried to meet them in battle died quickly. Abogran, the battle speaker, whose voice could inspire warriors to face impossible odds, fell with a Roman pilum through his heart. Mapones, the star reader, who could predict the movements of armies by observing celestial patterns, was cut down as he chanted protective words that had no power against iron and discipline. You survived because Cathbad foresaw this day. 3 months ago, as the autumn leaves turned the color of dried blood, he called you to his chamber in the sacred Nemeton, the inner sanctum where only the highest druids were permitted. The oak trees whisper of fire, he told you, his ancient fingers tracing patterns in the air that you recognized as protective sigils. The ravens speak of endings that are also beginnings. You must prepare yourself for the preservation of what cannot be lost. At the time, his words seemed like the cryptic utterances that all senior druids favored. Now, watching Roman soldiers hack down druids who had trained for 30 years to memorize the complete legal code of your people, you understand that Cathbad was not speaking in riddles but prophecy. The Romans don't simply want to defeat the Celts, they want to erase them. Every druid killed is a library burned, a legal system destroyed, a connection to the gods severed forever. The Romans understand what your own chieftains sometimes forget, that the Druids are the living memory of Celtic civilization, and without them, the tribes become just another collection of barbarians to be conquered and absorbed. Your hand tightens on the staff that Cathbad pressed into your palm before sending you into hiding. Carved from the heartwood of the great oak that had stood at the center of the Nemeton for 500 years, it bears the spiraling patterns that encode the 3 circles of existence, the realms of land, sea, and sky that encompass all knowledge. Hidden in its intricate designs are memory aids for the vast corpus of druidic learning, the Brehon laws that govern property, marriage, and justice, the genealogies that trace every noble family back to their divine ancestors, the seasonal rituals that maintain the balance between the worlds, the healing practices that can mend both body and spirit. But most importantly, the staff contains something the Romans would torture you to learn, the locations of the hidden schools where druidic teaching could continue in secret, the names of sympathetic nobles who might shelter fugitive druids, and the recognition signs that would allow the scattered survivors to find each other in the dark years ahead. As the flames consume the sacred grove, you begin the long journey that will define the rest of your life. You are no longer just Brenos the Druid in training. You are now one of the last keepers of a wisdom tradition that stretches back to the dawn of Celtic civilization. Your survival means the survival of everything your people hold sacred. The Romans have won this battle, but the war for the soul of Celtic culture has only just begun. 3 days after the burning of Mona, you find yourself in the mountains of Snowdonia, following paths known only to shepherds and fugitives. Your stomach cramps with hunger. The sacred fast that Druids undertook before major rituals has become an involuntary starvation as you avoid Roman patrols. But hunger is the least of your concerns. The real burden you carry is memory itself. 23 years of training have filled your mind with the accumulated wisdom of your people. But now, that knowledge feels less like a gift and more like a crushing responsibility. Every verse you forget, every law you misremember, every ritual you perform incorrectly is a piece of Celtic culture lost forever. The training began when you were 7 years old, selected from your tribe, not for noble birth, but for the quality your teacher called the hunger for knowing. While other children learned to hunt and fight, you memorized the names of trees, the properties of stones, the movements of stars. By your 10th year, you could recite the genealogies of all the major tribes of Britain and Gaul. The first great test came at 14, when you were required to memorize the complete corpus of Celtic law, 12 branches of jurisprudence, covering everything from cattle theft to ritual murder. The laws were not written down, but preserved in complex poetic formulae that took 3 years to master. Each law was connected to dozens of preceding cases, mythological examples, and philosophical principles that explain not just what was legal, but why. Law without understanding is tyranny. Cathbad taught you. Understanding without law is chaos. The Druid holds both in balance, serving neither king nor commoner, but the eternal principles that govern all right action. The legal training was followed by astronomical studies that required memorizing the movements of sun, moon, and stars across 19-year cycles. This knowledge allowed Druids to construct accurate calendars, predict eclipses, and determine the proper timing for agricultural and religious activities. More importantly, it demonstrated the Druids' mastery over forces that seemed magical to ordinary people. Healing came next, not just the herbal remedies that any wise woman might know, but the complex theories that connected physical illness to spiritual imbalance. You learned to read the subtle signs that revealed whether a patient's suffering stemmed from natural causes, violation of taboos, or malevolent magic. Each diagnosis required different treatments that might combine herbs, ritual purification, and negotiation with otherworldly forces. The final phase of training involved the sacred mysteries that were revealed only to those who had proven themselves worthy of the deepest trust. These included the secret names of the gods, the formulae for traveling between the worlds, and the knowledge of what lay beyond death. This wisdom was considered so powerful that revealing it to unauthorized persons was punishable by exile or death. Now, as you navigate treacherous mountain paths while avoiding Roman patrols, all of this knowledge weighs on your mind like physical cargo. You cannot write it down. The Druids maintain their power partly through the monopoly of oral tradition, and committing sacred knowledge to writing would make it vulnerable to theft or destruction. But you also cannot forget it, because in a world where every other Druid might be dead, you could be the last repository of wisdom that took centuries to accumulate. The loneliness is almost unbearable. Druidic training was always communal, with students learning through discussion, debate, and collaborative exploration of complex ideas. The isolation of fugitive life not only makes study impossible, but also deprives you of the intellectual community that gave meaning to the learning process. Worse still is the uncertainty about what to do with your knowledge. The traditional role of Druids, serving as judges, advisors, and ritual specialists for Celtic communities has been made impossible by Roman conquest. The legal system you memorized is meaningless when Roman law supersedes all Celtic custom. The astronomical knowledge that once seemed so important becomes irrelevant when Roman calendars dictate the timing of public life. As night falls and you make a cold camp in a cave that shepherds use during summer pasturing, you begin to understand the magnitude of the challenge facing any druid who hopes to preserve Celtic learning. It's not enough to simply remember the old knowledge. You must find ways to keep it relevant in a world that has been fundamentally transformed by conquest. The question that haunts your dreams is whether such preservation is even possible. Perhaps the Romans are right that druidism represents an obsolete past that must give way to imperial civilization. Perhaps your suffering serves no greater purpose than the death throes of a tradition that has outlived its usefulness. But then you remember Cathbad's final words to you. A tree that bends survives storms that destroy those that stand rigid. The wise adapt without abandoning their roots. Tomorrow you will begin the search for other survivors, other keepers of the old knowledge who might help you discover what forms druidism might take in a Roman world. Tonight, you simply focus on staying alive long enough to continue the search. Your first contact with the resistance comes 2 weeks later. In the most unlikely of places, a Roman garrison town in what was once the territory of the Ordovices tribe. The settlement bustles with the activity of imperial administration. Roman merchants trading for British gold and silver, auxiliary soldiers recruited from Germanic tribes, and local Celts who have accepted client status under the new regime. You enter the town disguised as an itinerant craftsman, your druidic staff hidden beneath a bundle of trade goods. You're distinctive, tonsure grown out and covered by a workman's cap. The transformation feels like a betrayal of everything you represent. But Cathbad taught you that survival sometimes requires strategic deception. The contact happens in the most ordinary way imaginable. You're haggling with a metalworker over the price of a bronze bracelet when he casually mentions that the design reminds him of the old spiral work that came from the sacred places. The phrase is innocuous enough to any Roman listener, but the specific combination of words, sacred places, rather than temples or shrines, marks him as someone who knows the old terminology. When you respond with an equally careful comment about patterns that connect the three realms, his eyes widen slightly in recognition. After the transaction is completed, he murmurs directions to a workshop outside town where similar work might be available. The workshop belongs to Lugotorix, a master metalsmith whose official clientele consists of Roman officials seeking Celtic jewelry and weapons as exotic souvenirs. His unofficial function is serving as a communication hub for the network of Druid survivors who have begun to find each other in the months since Mona's destruction. 17. He tells you as you examine his work by lamplight in the back room of his shop. 17 confirmed survivors that we know of, scattered from the Orkney Islands to the marshlands of East Anglia. Maybe more who haven't yet made contact. The number is both encouraging and devastating. Encouraging because it means the Druidic tradition has not been completely extinguished. Devastating because 17 survivors represent perhaps 1% of the Druids who were active in Britain before the conquest accelerated under Claudius and Nero. Most are living under assumed identities. Lugotorix continues, his hands never stopping their work on a bronze torque whose spiral patterns encode messages for other members of the network. Falco, you remember him from the gathering at Lugnasad 3 years ago? Has become a Roman-style physician in Londinium. His patients think he learned healing from Greek texts, but he's actually practicing traditional Celtic medicine under classical terminology. You do remember Falco, a brilliant young druid who specialized in healing, but also showed remarkable aptitude for languages and classical learning. The idea that he could successfully masquerade as a Roman physician while secretly maintaining Druidic practice offers hope that accommodation might be possible. What about teaching? You ask, are any of them able to pass on the knowledge? Lugotorix's expression darkens. That's the great problem. Traditional training required 20 years in recognized schools under acknowledged masters. We can't recreate that structure without attracting Roman attention. But without proper training, how do we ensure that what we pass on remains authentic rather than becoming corrupted folklore? It's a dilemma that has been keeping you awake at night. The oral tradition that preserved Druidic learning for centuries depended on rigorous standards and formal structures that are now impossible to maintain. Informal teaching risks gradual degradation of the knowledge, but formal schools risk discovery and annihilation. Some have tried to adapt, Lugotorix explains as he shows you a collection of metalwork that incorporates Druidic symbols into Roman-style designs. Ambiorix has established himself as a Celtic antiquarian in Camulodunum, collecting and preserving tribal genealogies for wealthy Romans who want to trace their British ancestry. Officially, it's historical curiosity. Unofficially, he's maintaining the bloodline records that are crucial for determining legitimate leadership in Celtic law. The network, you learn, operates through a combination of coded communication and strategic positioning. Members establish themselves in occupations that allow them to travel, gather information, and maintain contact with Celtic populations. Merchants, craftsmen, physicians, and even low-level Roman administrators who can access official documents. They communicate through a complex system of symbols embedded in everyday objects. The spiral patterns on Lugotorix's metalwork convey information about safe houses, meeting locations, and the movements of other network members. Celtic motifs in Roman-style artwork serve as recognition signs for initiates while appearing as harmless decoration to outsiders. Most importantly, the network has begun documenting Roman policies and military movements that affect Celtic populations. This intelligence serves both practical and strategic purposes, warning communities of impending raids or relocations, while also providing information that might someday prove useful if political circumstances change. The empire is not as stable as it appears, Lugotorix observes as he shows you reports from network members in Gaul and Hispania. There are always rebellions somewhere, always succession crises, always barbarian pressures on the frontiers. Patient people who preserve their knowledge and wait for opportunities might find their moment to emerge from hiding. As you spend several days in Lugotorix's workshop, learning the protocols and procedures that govern the network, you begin to understand that the surviving Druids are engaged in something more complex than simple resistance. They are attempting to create new forms of cultural preservation that can function within Roman society while maintaining the essential characteristics of Celtic tradition. It's a delicate balance that requires constant adaptation and innovation. Too much accommodation risks losing the distinctive features that make Celtic culture worth preserving. Too little accommodation risks discovery and destruction. Success demands intelligence, patience, and a willingness to experiment with forms of Druidism that previous generations would not have recognized. Your education in survival continues as Lugotorix introduces you to the various strategies that network members have developed for hiding in plain sight. The most successful disguises, you learn, are those that allow Druids to practice essential aspects of their calling while appearing to serve Roman interests. Varkasivilis, who once served as a legal expert for the Iceni tribe, has become a scribe in the Roman provincial administration. His official duties involve translating Celtic tribal customs into legal language that Roman courts can understand. Unofficially, he's creating written records of Celtic law that preserve traditional jurisprudence while making it appear to be historical research for administrative purposes. The Romans actually pay me to document our legal traditions, he explains during a clandestine meeting in a grove outside the town. They need to understand local customs to govern effectively, so they consider my work useful intelligence gathering. What they don't realize is that I'm preserving knowledge that might someday be used to re-establish independent Celtic justice. The irony is typical of the network's operations. By positioning themselves as helpful collaborators who can explain Celtic culture to Roman administrators, Druid survivors gain access to resources and protection while pursuing their own agenda of cultural preservation. Belvisis has taken a different approach, establishing himself as a Celtic philosopher who teaches Roman students about barbarian wisdom traditions. His curriculum officially focuses on natural philosophy and moral instruction that Romans consider intellectually fashionable. His actual teaching preserves Druidic cosmology and ethics under the guise of exotic philosophical speculation. Young Romans are fascinated by barbarian mysteries, he explains. They study Celtic philosophy the way their fathers studied Greek mysteries, as a sophisticated entertainment that demonstrates their cultural sophistication. As long as I frame Druidic teaching as classical philosophy with Celtic characteristics, I can pass on essential knowledge while appearing to serve Roman educational interests. The most audacious disguise belongs to Diviciacus, who has become a priest in the Roman religious establishment. His knowledge of astronomy and ritual procedure made him attractive to Roman religious authorities who needed expertise in calendar calculation and ceremonial protocol. His position gives him access to sacred sites and ritual implements, while allowing him to influence the religious practices of Romanized Celts. I perform Roman ceremonies with Celtic souls, he explains. The gods receive the appropriate honors, regardless of the names by which they are invoked. The spirits of place accept offerings whether they are called genii, loci, or local deities. The essential connections between people and the sacred remain intact even when the surface forms change. Each disguise requires different skills and carries different risks. Legal scribes must master Roman law well enough to avoid suspicion, while preserving Celtic jurisprudence without obvious contradiction. Philosophers must frame Druidic teaching in classical terminology without losing essential meanings. Priests must participate in Roman religious life while maintaining private devotion to Celtic deities. The psychological costs are enormous. Every network member struggles with questions of authenticity and compromise. How much accommodation is acceptable before you cease to be genuinely Celtic? How much preservation is possible before you become merely a collector of curiosities rather than a living practitioner of ancient wisdom? Sometimes I wonder if we're preserving Druidism or just creating elaborate antiquarian hobbies. Lugotorix admits during one of your late-night conversations. Are we keeping the tradition alive, or are we just dressing up Roman activities in Celtic costumes? It's a question that haunts everyone in the network, but it's also one that cannot be answered definitively while the work of preservation continues. The alternative to imperfect survival is complete extinction, and even corrupted. Transmission of knowledge is better than no transmission at all. Your own training in disguise begins with learning to think like a Ramang while maintaining Celtic consciousness. Lugotorix teaches you Latin legal terminology, classical rhetoric, and imperial administrative procedures. You practice presenting. Druidic knowledge in forms that Romans would find familiar and unthreatening. The hardest lesson is learning to hide your contempt for Roman arrogance and brutality. The network members who last longest are those who can genuinely appreciate certain aspects of Roman civilization while working to preserve what Romans seek to destroy. Simple hatred makes for poor disguises and eventually betrays itself through unconscious gestures and expressions. The Romans are not entirely wrong about everything, Lugotorix observes. Their engineering is impressive, their military organization is effective, and their legal system has some genuinely useful features. A Druid who can acknowledge Roman strengths while preserving Celtic wisdom is more likely to survive than one who sees only enemies and corruption. By the end of your month in the workshop, You have developed your own cover identity, a Celtic craftsman who specializes in creating authentic, barbarian artwork for Roman collectors. The role allows you to travel throughout Britain, gathering information about Celtic communities and making contact with potential network members. It also provides a legitimate reason for your knowledge of Celtic symbolism and mythology. Most importantly, it gives you a purpose that feels worthy of your training. Instead of simply hiding while your culture dies around you, you will actively work to preserve and transmit the knowledge that took 23 years to acquire. The form may be different from what previous generations of Druids would recognize, but the essential function remains the same. Your first teaching assignment comes sooner than expected. Lugotorix receives word through the network that a group of young Celts in Camulodunum, the Roman capital of Britain, have been asking dangerous questions about their heritage. Their inquiries have attracted attention from Roman authorities, making formal intervention necessary before someone gets arrested for sedition. The group consists of 5 individuals, all from prominent Celtic families that have accepted client status under Roman rule. Their Roman education has given them literacy and classical learning, but it has also filled them with questions about their own cultural heritage that their Romanized parents cannot or will not answer. Marukos, the informal leader, is the son of a tribal chieftain who now serves as a Roman auxiliary commander. His classical education included extensive study of Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars, which sparked his curiosity about the Druids his father refuses to discuss. Caesar writes about Druids as if they were philosophers and scientists. He explains during your first secret meeting in an abandoned temple outside the city. But when I ask my father about them, he changes the subject or talks about barbarous superstitions that enlightened people have abandoned. I want to know what we've actually lost. His companions share similar frustrations. Ludovic has studied rhetoric in Rome itself and became fascinated by references to Celtic oratory and classical texts. Bellatrix learned Greek medicine, but heard whispers about superior Celtic healing traditions that supposedly went far beyond herbal remedies. Dabnovelnus developed an interest in astronomy that classical texts suggested was less advanced than the calculations performed by barbarian priests. Teaching them requires a complete reconstruction of traditional Druidic pedagogy. The classical model involved 20-year apprenticeships in isolated schools, where students could focus entirely on memorizing vast quantities of oral tradition. Your students are young adults with other responsibilities who can meet only occasionally and must learn through methods that don't require years of full-time study. You begin with the framework that underlies all Druidic learning, the 3 circles of existence that encompass all knowledge and experience. The circle of land includes everything related to the physical world, geography, natural history, agriculture, and the practical skills needed for survival. The circle of sea represents the realm of emotion, intuition, and the forces that flow between all living things. The circle of sky encompasses the intellectual and spiritual dimensions, law, poetry, astronomy, and the sacred knowledge that connects human consciousness to divine reality. Every aspect of Druidic training fits somewhere within these 3 circles, you explain, using symbols carved into tree bark to illustrate the relationships. But unlike Roman education, which divides knowledge into separate subjects, our tradition recognizes that everything is connected. Understanding plants requires knowing their spiritual properties as well as their physical characteristics. Legal decisions must consider emotional and celestial influences as well as precedent and logic. The holistic approach initially confuses your students, who have been trained to think in the compartmentalized fashion that characterizes classical education. But gradually, they begin to appreciate the sophistication of a system that treats all knowledge as interconnected aspects of a unified reality. Legal training proves especially challenging because Celtic law operates on principles that are fundamentally different from Roman jurisprudence. Roman law emphasizes written statutes, imperial authority, and standardized procedures that can be applied throughout the empire. Celtic law relies on oral tradition, community consensus, and flexible approaches that can be adapted to local circumstances. In Roman law, you explain, the question is always, what does the written code say about this type of case? In Celtic law, the question is what solution will restore harmony between the parties and maintain community peace. The approaches can lead to very different conclusions, even when the facts are identical. You teach them to memorize legal precedents not as rigid rules, but as examples of how wise judges have balanced competing interests in specific situations. Each case study includes not just the decision, but the reasoning process that led to it, the community response it generated, and the long-term consequences it produced. Astronomical instruction requires even more creative adaptation. Traditional Druidic astronomy involved elaborate calculations performed entirely in the mind, using memory techniques that took years to master. Your students need practical knowledge that they can apply immediately, while gradually building toward more sophisticated understanding. You start by teaching them to construct simple observation tools using materials that won't attract suspicion, wooden measuring sticks, knotted cords for calculating angles, and carved stones that serve as permanent markers for tracking celestial movements. The knowledge appears to be practical skills useful for agriculture and navigation, but it actually provides the foundation for understanding the cosmic patterns that influence human affairs. The most dangerous part of the curriculum involves what Romans would consider magic, the techniques for communicating with otherworldly forces and manipulating the flows of spiritual energy that Druids believe permeate all existence. This knowledge cannot be shared safely until you are certain of your students' discretion and commitment. After 3 months of careful evaluation, you begin teaching them the basic techniques of Celtic divination, reading omens in natural phenomena, interpreting dreams and visions, and entering the altered states of consciousness that allow communication with spirits and deities. The practices are taught as philosophical exercises in developing intuition and understanding symbolic thinking. They actually provide access to sources of knowledge that Romans would consider supernatural 6 months into your teaching work. In Cameo Legionum, the delicate balance of secrecy and education faces its first serious test. Dobno Velonis, the student most interested in astronomical knowledge, makes a crucial error in judgment that threatens to expose the entire operation. Excited by his growing understanding of Celtic calendar calculations, he attempts to demonstrate his knowledge by publicly predicting a lunar eclipse using traditional Druidic methods. The prediction proves accurate, but his use of non-Roman techniques to make the calculation attracts unwanted attention from imperial officials who are tasked with monitoring potentially seditious activities. A young Briton using barbarian methods to predict celestial events is how the report to the provincial governor describes the incident. In the paranoid atmosphere that followed the Boudica rebellion just a few years earlier, any display of non-Roman knowledge by Celtic youth is automatically suspect. The investigation that follows forces you to make desperate improvisations to protect both your students and the broader network. Working with Vercus Ivalias, the legal scribe in the provincial administration, you construct a cover story that presents Dobnovelonis' knowledge as the result of academic curiosity rather than systematic instruction in Druidic learning. The young man has been studying classical, astronomical texts and became interested in comparing Greek and barbarian approaches to calendar calculation. Vercus Ivalias explains to the investigating officials his eclipse prediction was an experiment in testing ancient methodologies, not an expression of religious or political resistance. The explanation is plausible enough to avoid immediate arrests, but but it requires sacrificing the carefully constructed teaching relationship you had developed with your students. To maintain their cover, they must appear to abandon their interest in Celtic learning and focus exclusively on approved Roman subjects. The forced separation is devastating for everyone involved. Your students lose access to knowledge they had only begun to understand, while you lose the sense of purpose that teaching had provided. Worse still, the incident demonstrates how easily the entire preservation effort could be destroyed by a single moment of carelessness or excessive enthusiasm. This is why the old schools required 20 years of training, Lugatorix observes when you return to his workshop. Students needed time to develop not just knowledge, but the judgment to use it wisely. We're trying to compress decades of learning into months or years, and the shortcuts create dangerous vulnerabilities. The network's response to the near disaster involves implementing new security protocols that make teaching even more difficult. Future instruction must be even more carefully disguised. Student selection must be more rigorous, and the knowledge transmitted must be further limited to reduce the risks of exposure. But the incident also reveals an unexpected opportunity. The official investigation, while threatening, also demonstrates that Roman authorities are not specifically looking for Druidic activity. Their concerns focus on political resistance rather than cultural preservation, which means that properly disguised educational activities might be safer than anyone had previously assumed. They're watching for rebellion, not scholarship, Burkasivilis reports after reviewing the official files. As long as we can present what we're doing as academic research rather than religious or political instruction, we might have more freedom than we've been assuming. This insight leads to a fundamental shift in the network's approach to preservation. Instead of trying to recreate traditional Druidic schools in secret, they begin developing new models that present Celtic learning as historical and philosophical research that serves Roman intellectual interests. The strategy requires even more sophisticated disguises and greater knowledge of classical learning, but it also offers possibilities for more systematic preservation than purely clandestine teaching could achieve. Roman scholars are genuinely interested in barbarian wisdom traditions, which creates opportunities for sharing authentic knowledge within officially sanctioned academic contexts. Your own role evolves accordingly. Instead of being a secret teacher, working with a small group of students, you become a Celtic cultural consultant who helps Roman scholars understand the intellectual achievements of conquered peoples. The work requires careful presentation of Druidic knowledge in classical terminology, but it also allows for more systematic documentation and transmission than underground teaching permitted. The transformation feels like another betrayal of traditional forms, but it also represents a realistic adaptation to circumstances that make orthodox preservation impossible. As Cathbad taught you, a tree that bends survives storms that destroy. Those that stand rigid, the essential knowledge can be preserved even when the traditional structures cannot be maintained. The question that continues to haunt your work is whether this kind of adaptation preserves the true spirit of Druidism or merely creates an intellectual fossil that bears little resemblance to the living tradition it supposedly represents. But with Roman persecution making traditional practice impossible, imperfect preservation remains preferable to complete extinction. Your students, meanwhile, must find their own ways to continue learning within the constraints imposed by Roman suspicion. Some abandon their Celtic interests entirely, deciding that the risks outweigh the benefits. Others find ways to pursue their studies privately, using the foundation you provided to guide independent research into their cultural heritage. Maroukos proves most resourceful in maintaining his education. He begins corresponding with network members throughout Britain, presenting himself as a Roman citizen interested in documenting tribal genealogies for administrative purposes. His letters actually contain carefully coded requests for specific types of knowledge, and the responses he receives gradually build. His understanding of Celtic law and custom. I'm learning to be a druid through correspondence, he tells you during a brief, carefully planned encounter months after the forced separation. It's slower than face-to-face instruction, but it's also safer and allows me to connect with more teachers than would ever have been possible under the old system. His example suggests that the network's forced evolution might actually create new opportunities for knowledge transmission that are more resilient than traditional approaches. Distributed learning networks are harder for authorities to detect and destroy than centralized schools, and they can adapt more quickly to changing circumstances. 2 years after the Camulodunum incident, the network has evolved into something that previous generations of druids would barely recognize, but that proves surprisingly effective at preserving and transmitting Celtic knowledge under Roman rule. The scattered group of survivors has become a sophisticated organization that combines cultural preservation with intelligence gathering and strategic planning. The transformation reflects hard-learned lessons about the requirements for survival in an occupied territory. Pure resistance leads to destruction, while pure collaboration leads to cultural extinction. Success requires finding the narrow path between these extremes, appearing to serve Roman interests while actually preserving Celtic independence. Your own development exemplifies this evolution. No longer just a keeper of traditional knowledge, you have become something new, a cultural intelligence operative who uses academic research as cover for gathering information about Roman policies and Celtic resistance. Your work as a barbarian studies consultant gives you access to official documents while allowing you to maintain contact with Celtic communities throughout Britain. The intelligence network that has grown around cultural preservation serves multiple purposes. It tracks Roman military movements and administrative decisions that affect Celtic populations. It identifies opportunities for network members to gain influence within the imperial system. Most importantly, it gathers information about Celtic communities that might be receptive to cultural revival when circumstances permit, or not just. Preserving knowledge, explains Ambiorix during a network gathering disguised as an academic conference on British antiquities. We're mapping the landscape of possibility for future Celtic Renaissance. Every Roman weakness we identify, every sympathetic official we cultivate, every young Celt we educate becomes a potential resource for eventual liberation. The long-term strategy that emerges from these discussions involves creating conditions for cultural and political revival by positioning network members throughout Roman society while maintaining connections to Celtic communities that have preserved their traditional loyalties. When imperial authority weakens through civil war, barbarian invasion, or internal collapse, the network will be positioned to provide leadership for Celtic resurgence. This strategic thinking requires a more sophisticated understanding of Roman civilization than simple resistance would demand. Network members must study imperial administration, military organization, and political dynamics with the same intensity that previous generations devoted to Celtic law and ritual. The enemy must be understood in detail before it can be effectively opposed. Your role in this intelligence effort involves traveling throughout Britain while conducting research on tribal customs and genealogies. The work brings you into contact with Roman administrators who need information about local populations, and Celtic nobles who have maintained traditional authority despite imperial conquest. Through these contacts, you begin to understand the complex dynamics that shape life in occupied Britain. Roman rule is not the monolithic tyranny that resistance propaganda suggests, nor is Celtic collaboration as complete as imperial officials claim. Instead, both Romans and Celts are engaged in an ongoing negotiation that creates opportunities for influence and subversion. Many Roman administrators are actually quite sympathetic to Celtic culture. viewing traditional customs as interesting local variations rather than dangerous threats to imperial authority. Some are genuinely scholars who appreciate the intellectual sophistication of Druidic learning. Others are practical administrators who recognize that understanding local traditions makes governance more effective. These sympathetic Romans become unwitting allies in the preservation effort. They provide resources for documenting Celtic traditions, protect network members who appear to be helpful collaborators, and sometimes share information about imperial policies that affect Celtic communities. Celtic nobles present different opportunities and challenges. Many have genuine loyalty to traditional culture, but have also made practical accommodations with Roman authority that they cannot easily abandon. They need to balance their desire to preserve Celtic identity with their need to maintain their positions within the imperial system. The most useful nobles are those who have achieved genuine influence within Roman administration while maintaining private commitment to Celtic interests. They can provide protection for network activities, advance sympathetic policies, and serve as bridges between traditional Celtic communities and the imperial system. Cartimandua, the former queen of the Brigantes who collaborated with Rome during the conquest, represents the most complex case. Publicly reviled by Celtic resistance as a traitor who sold her people for imperial favor, she privately maintains connections to Druidic traditions and provides subtle support for cultural preservation efforts. I chose collaboration because I believed it offered the best chance for my people's survival. She explains during a secret meeting arranged through network intermediaries. I may have been wrong about immediate benefits, but the position I've established gives me opportunities to influence long-term outcomes that pure resistance could never achieve. Her support proves crucial for protecting network activities in northern Britain, where Roman control is less complete and traditional Celtic authority structures remain more intact. Through her influence, network members gain access to tribal communities that might otherwise be suspicious of anyone with Roman connections. The relationships you develop through intelligence work gradually transform your understanding of the conquest and its aftermath. What initially appeared to be a simple conflict between Celtic freedom and Roman tyranny reveals itself as a complex process, involving multiple competing interests and constantly shifting alliances. Some Romans genuinely respect Celtic culture and would support its preservation if they could do so without appearing to oppose imperial policy. Some Celts believe that accommodation with Rome offers better prospects for cultural survival than continued resistance. Many people on both sides are primarily concerned with practical matters of survival and prosperity, rather than abstract questions of cultural authenticity or political loyalty. These nuanced relationships create opportunities for advancing Celtic interests through means other than direct confrontation. Influence, persuasion, and strategic alliance building sometimes achieve more than armed resistance, though they also require compromises that pure resistors find morally troubling. By the 5th year after Mona's destruction, the network has successfully established what amount to secret Druidic schools disguised as Roman educational institutions. These academies appear to offer classical education enhanced by local cultural content, but they actually provide systematic training in Celtic law, astronomy, healing, and spiritual practice. The most successful of these schools operates in Aquae Sulis, modern Bath, where the Roman fascination with Celtic thermal springs has created an atmosphere of cultural blending that makes Druidic instruction less conspicuous. Officially known as the Academy for Provincial Studies, it attracts Roman students interested in exotic British customs, as well as young Celts seeking practical education that will serve them in the imperial system. Belvis serves as the Academy's nominal director, presenting himself as a Celtic scholar who helps Roman administrators understand local traditions while providing young Britons with classical education that prepares them for imperial service. His dual role gives him perfect cover for maintaining Druidic instruction within an apparently Roman institution. We teach the same knowledge that was transmitted in the old schools. He explains during your visit to evaluate the academy's success, but we frame it differently. Astronomical calculation becomes mathematics useful for engineering and navigation. Legal precedents become case studies in provincial administration. Healing techniques become natural philosophy applied to medical practice. The student body includes both Romans and Celts, which creates interesting dynamics. Roman students bring classical learning and imperial perspectives that challenge Druidic ideas in productive ways. Celtic students provide cultural authenticity and traditional knowledge that Romans find fascinating. The interaction between these groups generates genuine educational innovation while preserving essential cultural content. The curriculum carefully balances classical and Celtic elements to maintain credibility with Roman authorities while ensuring that traditional knowledge receives adequate attention. Morning classes focus on Latin, rhetoric, and imperial law, subjects that any Roman educator would expect to find in a provincial academy. Afternoon sessions cover local studies that include Celtic language, customs, and traditions presented as anthropological research rather than cultural preservation. The most sensitive instruction happens during evening seminars that appear to be philosophical discussions, but actually transmit Druidic spiritual and magical practices. These sessions are limited to students who have demonstrated both competence and discretion, and they're conducted using terminology that would appear innocuous to casual observers. We're teaching them to walk between the worlds, Bellevicis explains, using traditional Druidic language to describe spiritual practices that students learn as exercises in developing intuitive reasoning. The essential techniques remain unchanged, but the conceptual framework has been adapted to make them acceptable within a Roman educational context. Similar schools have been established in Londinium, Eburicum, and other major cities where Roman interest in local culture provides cover for more extensive Celtic education. Each institution develops its own approach based on local circumstances, but all share the basic strategy of hiding traditional instruction within apparently classical curricula. The schools also serve as recruitment centers for the broader network. Students who demonstrate particular aptitude and commitment receive advanced training that prepares them for roles as teachers, intelligence operatives, or community leaders. Graduation from one of the hidden schools becomes a kind of modern Druidic initiation that marks individuals as qualified to carry forward Celtic traditions. Your own involvement with the school system includes developing standardized curricula that ensure consistent quality of instruction while adapting to local variations. The work requires creating teaching materials that appear to be classical texts, but actually preserve Druidic knowledge in forms that can be transmitted safely. One of your most important projects involves compiling a compendium of British tribal customs that presents Celtic law as historical documentation rather than active legal tradition. The text appears to be scholarly research useful for Roman administrators, but it actually provides complete instruction in traditional jurisprudence for anyone who understands the coded presentation. Similar projects document Celtic astronomical knowledge as ingenious calculation methods, healing practices as local medical traditions, and spiritual techniques as ethnographic observations of barbarian religious customs. Each text serves dual purposes, satisfying Roman curiosity about conquered peoples while preserving authentic Druidic learning for future generations. The hidden schools represent the network's most successful adaptation to Roman rule. They provide systematic education that approaches the quality of traditional Druidic training while remaining safe from official persecution. They also create opportunities for expanding the network by identifying and training new members who can carry forward the preservation effort. But the schools also raise fundamental questions about the nature of authentic cultural transmission. Students who learn Druidic traditions in Roman institutional contexts inevitably approach the knowledge differently than those who receive traditional forest-based education. The content may be the same, but the cultural meaning is inevitably transformed by the different learning environment. Are we training druids or scholars of druidism? Asks Diviciacus during one of the network's periodic self-evaluation discussions. The students learn the same facts and techniques, but do they develop the same consciousness, the same spiritual relationship to the knowledge? It's a question that has no definitive answer, but the practical alternatives make philosophical purity a luxury the network cannot afford. Traditional druidic consciousness may be impossible to recreate under Roman rule, but modified forms of Celtic awareness can still be transmitted and preserved for future revival when circumstances permit more authentic practice. The students themselves seem largely untroubled by questions of authenticity. They appreciate gaining access to their cultural heritage, regardless of the institutional context, and they adapt the knowledge to their own circumstances without excessive concern for maintaining orthodox forms. Marukos, now serving as a teaching assistant at the Aquisilis Academy, represents the new generation of Celts who are comfortable combining traditional and classical learning. I'm not trying to become the same kind of druid that existed before the conquest, he explains. I'm trying to become the kind of Celt who can preserve our traditions while functioning effectively in a Roman world. His perspective reflects a pragmatic approach that prioritizes cultural survival over ideological purity. The traditions may evolve and adapt, but they remain recognizably Celtic and continue to provide meaning and identity for people who might otherwise be completely Romanized. As the network's educational institutions mature, attention turns to the even more challenging problem of preserving and adapting Celtic religious practices under Roman rule. Unlike legal or astronomical knowledge, which can be disguised as academic subjects, Druidic spirituality involves practices that Romans explicitly associate with sedition and barbarism. The challenge is compounded by the fact that traditional Celtic religion was intimately connected to specific landscapes, sacred groves, springs, stone circles, and burial mounds that are now under Roman control. Many sites have been destroyed or converted to imperial religious use, while others are monitored by authorities who watch for signs of continuing Celtic worship. The solution that emerges involves creating portable religious practices that can be performed safely in private settings while maintaining the essential spiritual connections that define Druidic worship. This development represents perhaps the most radical adaptation of Celtic tradition, but it also proves essential for preserving the religious dimension of Druidic identity. Diviciacus, working from his position within the Roman religious establishment, plays a crucial role in developing these adapted practices. His official duties include overseeing religious festivals and maintaining sacred sites, which gives him opportunities to preserve Celtic spiritual elements within Roman ceremonial contexts. The gods care more about the sincerity of worship than the specific forms it takes, he explains during a clandestine gathering in an abandoned villa outside Verolamin. Roman rituals performed with Celtic consciousness can serve the same spiritual functions as traditional ceremonies, especially when the practitioners understand the deeper meanings behind the surface actions. The adapted liturgy that develops under his guidance incorporates Celtic prayers, invocations, and seasonal observances into Roman religious frameworks. Celtic deities are identified with Roman counterparts who share similar attributes, allowing worshippers to honor traditional gods while appearing to participate in imperial religion. Law, the Celtic god of skill and craftsmanship, becomes Mercury when honored in Roman contexts. Brigantia, the goddess of healing and poetry, merges with Minerva for purposes of public worship. The Morrigan, the complex deity associated with war and prophecy, finds expression through various aspects of Mars and Apollo. The identification is more than simple disguise, Diviciacus insists. Roman and Celtic deities often represent different cultural approaches to the same spiritual realities. Learning to perceive the connections between them actually deepens understanding of both traditions. The seasonal festivals that are central to Celtic spiritual life require even more creative adaptation. The great celebrations of Samhain Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad cannot be observed in their traditional forms without attracting dangerous attention, but their essential spiritual functions can be preserved through modified practices. Samhain, the festival marking the beginning of winter, and the opening of communication between the worlds of the living and the dead, becomes a private observance focused on ancestor veneration rather than community celebration. Network members gather in small groups to honor deceased druids and request their guidance in preserving Celtic traditions. Imbolc, traditionally a celebration of the first signs of spring and the renewal of creative energies, transforms into personal rituals of commitment to cultural preservation work. Individual network members use the occasion to renew their dedication to maintaining Celtic knowledge and supporting resistance activities. Beltane and Lugnasad, the festivals celebrating fertility and harvest, become opportunities for network communication and planning. Gatherings disguised as agricultural festivals or craft fairs allow members to share information, coordinate activities, and provide mutual support while appearing to participate in approved seasonal celebrations. The most sensitive adaptations involve the divinatory and magical practices that Romans most associate with dangerous druidic activities. Traditional augury, dream interpretation, and spirit communication must be conducted with extreme discretion while maintaining their effectiveness for guidance and protection. Working with healers in the network, you develop techniques for maintaining magical practice under medical disguises. Herbal healing provides cover for gathering and using plants with spiritual as well as physical properties. Discussions of dreams and omens can be presented as psychological counseling rather than supernatural. Communication. The challenge of magical practice leads to one of the most important innovations in adapted druidism: the development of internal techniques that require no external implements or observances. Traditional druids relied heavily on sacred sites, ritual tools, and community ceremonies. But the new circumstances require practices that can be performed entirely within the practitioner's consciousness. The true sacred grove is the mind properly attuned to spiritual reality. Becomes a fundamental principle of underground druidic practice. Through intensive mental training, network members learn to achieve the altered states of consciousness that allow communication with otherworldly forces without requiring external ritual support. These internal practices prove surprisingly effective, perhaps because they force practitioners to develop deeper levels of spiritual discipline than external rituals typically require. Without the support of sacred sites and community energy, individual druids must cultivate more refined sensitivity to subtle spiritual influences. The adapted liturgy that emerges from this process preserves the essential functions of Celtic spirituality while making it compatible with life under Roman rule. Practitioners maintain their connection to traditional deities, observe seasonal rhythms, and access otherworldly guidance without engaging in activities that would identify them as druidic resistors. But the adaptations also create theological and practical challenges that traditional druidism never faced. How much modification is acceptable before worship ceases to be authentically Celtic? Can private practice substitute for the community ceremonies that were central to traditional religion? Do the spiritual realities remain the same when the cultural forms change so dramatically? These questions generate ongoing debates within the network, but they also stimulate theological development that enriches Celtic spiritual understanding. The need to distinguish essential spiritual principles from particular cultural expressions forces practitioners to think more deeply about the foundations of their religious tradition. or discovering aspects of our spirituality that we never noticed when practice was easy and unthinking. Observes Cathbad's former student Senbeck, who has become one of the leading theorists of adapted druidism. Persecution has forced us to understand our religion in ways that comfort and tradition never required. The theological sophistication that develops through adaptation may actually represent an advance over traditional forms of Celtic spirituality, even though it emerges from circumstances of oppression and cultural crisis. The need to maintain authentic spiritual connection under hostile conditions produces innovations that enrich rather than diminish Druidic religious understanding. 10 years after the burning of Mona, the preservation network has expanded far beyond its original focus on Britain to include Druidic survivors throughout the Celtic world. Contacts with Gaul, Hispania, and Ireland create opportunities for sharing knowledge and coordinating resistance activities across the entire sphere of Celtic culture. The expansion begins when Lugatorix receives a visit from a traveling merchant who identifies himself using recognition signs known only to network members. The visitor, who calls himself Brenius, claims to represent a group of Druidic survivors in central Gaul who have been working independently to preserve Celtic traditions under Roman rule. We heard rumors through trading networks about British Druids who survived the persecution, he explains during a carefully arranged meeting. Our community sent me to investigate whether cooperation might be possible. The existence of parallel preservation efforts in Gaul provides both encouragement and new challenges for the British network. Encouragement because it demonstrates that Druidic survival is not limited to Britain and that the tradition has proven resilient throughout the Celtic world. Challenges because coordination between different regions requires even more sophisticated security arrangements and communication protocols. Initial exchanges focus on sharing information about survival strategies that have proven effective in different contexts. The Gallic network has developed approaches that emphasize economic integration with Roman society, positioning Druidic survivors as essential intermediaries between imperial administration and Celtic communities. British survivors have focused more on intellectual and cultural preservation. Through educational institutions and scholarly research, the Gauls have maintained more contact with traditional communities. You observe after reviewing their reports. But we've achieved better penetration of Roman administrative and educational systems. Combining our approaches might be more effective than either strategy alone. The collaboration that develops involves establishing trade routes that serve as communication channels, while creating economic benefits that help justify the extensive travel required for network coordination. Lugatorix's metalworking business becomes the British headquarters for this commercial network, while workshops in Gaul serve similar functions in their regions. The expanded network also creates opportunities for sharing preserved knowledge that has been lost in particular regions. British survivors have maintained strong traditions in legal and astronomical learning, while Gallic communities have preserved more complete healing and agricultural knowledge. Irish contacts, established through traders who regularly cross the narrow seas, provide access to bardic traditions that have remained more intact than their counterparts in occupied territories. We're reconstructing the complete corpus of Druidic learning by combining what different communities have managed to preserve, explains Ambiorix during a gathering that includes representatives from throughout the Celtic world. No single region maintained everything, but together we can recover knowledge that seemed permanently lost. The reconstruction process requires developing new methods for verifying authenticity and resolving conflicts between different traditional versions of the same material. When British legal traditions differ from Gallic precedents, or when Irish healing practices contradict techniques preserved in Hispania, the network must determine which versions represent the most accurate preservation. These scholarly challenges lead to the development of comparative Druidic studies that treat different regional traditions as variations on common themes, rather than competing claims to exclusive authenticity. The approach proves intellectually productive while also serving practical needs for training that can adapt to local circumstances. Your own role in the expanded network involves coordinating the scholarly reconstruction project while maintaining your cover as a researcher in British tribal customs. The work requires extensive travel and correspondence that provides perfect justification for the communication activities that network coordination requires. The expansion also creates new security challenges as increased activity and communication raise the risks of detection by Roman authorities. The network responds by developing more sophisticated protocols for compartmentalizing information and limiting individual members' knowledge of overall operations. No single person should know enough to compromise the entire network if captured. Becomes a fundamental security principle. Even senior members like yourself are kept ignorant of activities in regions where you have no operational need for information. The compartmentalization makes coordination more difficult but provides essential protection against the consequences of betrayal or capture. When a network member in southern Gaul is arrested and interrogated, the information he can provide to Roman authorities reveals only local activities without compromising operations in other regions. The arrest also demonstrates that the network's growth has attracted attention from imperial intelligence services that are specifically tasked with monitoring inter-regional resistance activities. The expanded scope of operations makes the preservation effort more effective, but also more visible to enemies who have the resources to coordinate sophisticated surveillance across multiple provinces. The network's response involves implementing new levels of security that make collaboration more difficult, but also more secure. Communication protocols become more elaborate. Recognition signs are changed regularly, and new members undergo more extensive vetting before being trusted with sensitive information. These security measures prove their value when Roman authorities launch a coordinated investigation into barbarian conspiracy activities that they believe are being coordinated across multiple provinces. The investigation discovers evidence of communication networks and commercial relationships, but the compartmentalized structure prevents investigators from understanding the true nature and scope of the preservation effort. They know something is happening, reports Verkas Volas after reviewing official investigation files, but they can't determine whether they're looking at commercial networks, criminal enterprises, or political resistance. The ambiguity actually protects us as long as we maintain operational discipline. The expanded network survives the investigation with minimal losses, but the experience demonstrates both the possibilities and the dangers of large-scale coordination. The preservation effort has achieved unprecedented success in maintaining Celtic traditions across the entire sphere of Celtic culture, but it has also created vulnerabilities that require constant vigilance to manage. 15 years after Mona's destruction, the network faces a new challenge that threatens its long-term survival: the need to transfer leadership and knowledge to a generation that has no direct memory of pre-conquest Druidism. The original survivors are aging, and the young people they have trained approach Celtic traditions from perspectives inevitably shaped by Roman cultural dominance. This generational transition forces fundamental questions about the nature of cultural continuity. Can traditions transmitted under conditions of hiding and adaptation maintain their authentic character across generations? The young Celts who learned Druidism through Roman educational institutions developed the same relationship to the knowledge as those who received traditional forest-based training. Marukos, now 30 years old and serving as a senior instructor at the Aquisules Academy, represents the new generation's approach to these questions. His understanding of Celtic traditions is comprehensive and sophisticated, but it's also inevitably influenced by classical learning and Roman institutional context that previous generations never experienced. I don't pretend to be the same kind of druid that existed before the conquest, he explained during a network meeting focused on succession planning, but I'm not trying to be a Roman either. I'm creating something new that combines the best of both traditions while maintaining the essential spirit of Celtic identity. His approach reflects practical necessities as much as philosophical choices. Young Celts living under Roman rule cannot simply reject imperial culture without destroying their prospects for success and survival. They must find ways to be authentically Celtic within Roman institutional frameworks, which requires adaptation rather than pure preservation. The challenge is determining which adaptations preserve essential cultural characteristics and which represent fundamental betrayals of Celtic values. The original network members, who experienced traditional druidism before conquest, serve as guardians of authenticity. But their knowledge is increasingly irrelevant to circumstances that young Celts actually face. We old ones know what we're trying to preserve. You observe during discussions about leadership transition, but we don't always understand what can be preserved under current conditions. The young ones understand current possibilities, but they lack the reference points needed to judge what's essential versus what's merely convenient. The solution that emerges involves pairing experienced preservers with young practitioners in mentoring. Relationships that combine traditional knowledge with contemporary adaptation skills. Each partnership becomes a laboratory for developing approaches to druidism that can function effectively in Roman contexts while maintaining authentic Celtic characteristics. Your own mentoring relationship with Marukos proves particularly productive. Your deep knowledge of traditional practices provides essential context for his innovations, while his understanding of Roman culture helps you identify adaptation strategies that you would never have considered independently together. You develop training programs that provide young druids with solid grounding in traditional knowledge, while preparing them for the practical challenges of maintaining Celtic identity under imperial rule. The curriculum includes not just classical, druidic subjects, but also Roman law, imperial administration, and Christian theology, subjects that previous generations never needed to master. We're training cultural diplomats, Marukos observes. People who can function effectively in multiple cultural contexts while maintaining primary loyalty to Celtic traditions. It's a more complex role than traditional druids ever played, but it's also potentially more influential than new generations. Approach to druidism emphasizes intellectual sophistication and cultural synthesis, rather than the mystical authority that characterized traditional practice. Young druids position themselves as scholarly experts in Celtic culture, rather than spiritual authorities with supernatural powers. The transformation makes them more acceptable to Roman society, while potentially diminishing their influence within Celtic communities. This shift in emphasis creates tensions within the network between members who prioritize cultural preservation and those who focus on practical adaptation. Some original survivors worry that excessive accommodation will transform druidism into an academic curiosity rather than a living spiritual tradition. Some young practitioners argue that rigid adherence to traditional forms makes Celtic culture irrelevant to contemporary circumstances. We're trying to preserve something that was never meant to be preserved, argues Litovicus, one of your former students who's become a successful advocate for Celtic legal rights within the Roman court system. Druidism was always a living tradition that adapted to changing circumstances. Our responsibility is to keep it alive, not to maintain it as a museum piece. The counterargument advanced by Bellovicis and other traditionalists emphasizes the irreplaceable value of ancient wisdom that took centuries to develop. Once we lose connection to traditional sources of knowledge, he insists, we can never fully recover what we've abandoned. Adaptation is necessary, but it must be guided by deep understanding of what we're adapting. These philosophical debates ultimately prove less important than practical necessities imposed by changing political circumstances. The network must prepare for a leadership transition, regardless of theoretical disagreements about authenticity and adaptation. The question is not whether change will occur, but whether it can be managed in ways that preserve essential characteristics while enabling continued survival. The succession process that develops involves gradual transfer of responsibilities, rather than sudden replacement of leadership. Experienced members continue serving in advisory roles, while younger practitioners assume operational control of network activities. The arrangement provides continuity while allowing innovation within established frameworks. Your own transition involves shifting from active teaching and intelligence gathering to serving as a senior advisor who provides historical context for contemporary decisions. The role allows you to influence network development while acknowledging that detailed operational decisions must be made by people who understand current circumstances better than original survivors possibly can. The process is personally difficult because it requires accepting that the druidism you help preserve will continue evolving in directions you might not have chosen. But it's also rewarding because it demonstrates that Celtic traditions have proven resilient enough to survive not just Roman persecution, but also the challenge of generational transition. 20 years after Mona's destruction, the network faces an unexpected new challenge from the growing influence of Christianity among Celtic populations. The foreign religion, while initially welcomed by some Celts as another form of resistance to Roman paganism, begins to present serious competition for the loyalty of young people who might otherwise be recruited for Druidic preservation efforts. The challenge is particularly acute because Christianity offers many of the same attractions as adapted Druidism: connection to ancient wisdom traditions, resistance to purely materialistic values, and community identity that transcends imperial political structures. But Christian communities also provide social support and institutional protection that underground Druidic networks cannot match. Half the young Celts who would have been our best recruits are now studying Christian theology instead of Druidic law. Reports to Vishicus during a network gathering in Londinium. They're attracted to mystery religions and spiritual community, but they're finding what they want in churches rather than in our hidden schools. The Christian challenge forces fundamental reassessment of the network's approach to cultural preservation. Traditional Druidism was the established religion of Celtic societies, competing only with local variations and tribal differences. Adapted Druidism must compete with both Ramang, paganism, and Christian monotheism for the attention of young people who have many spiritual options. Some network members advocate direct competition with Christianity, emphasizing the superior authenticity and cultural relevance of Celtic traditions. Others argue for accommodation or even cooperation, pointing out that Christian and Druidic values share important common elements that might allow for synthesis. Christianity is fundamentally an Oriental mystery religion, observes Senbeck, who has made extensive study of Christian texts and practices, but it's being adapted to Celtic cultural contexts in ways that preserve many traditional values while providing better institutional support than we can offer. His analysis reveals that Celtic Christianity is developing distinctive characteristics that incorporate elements of traditional spirituality within Christian theological frameworks. Celtic monasteries emphasize connection to natural landscapes in ways that resemble Druidic sacred sites. Celtic Christian art incorporates spiral patterns and symbolic motifs that derive from traditional Celtic imagery. Most significantly, Celtic Christian leaders are preserving knowledge of traditional culture within Christian educational institutions. Monasteries become repositories for Celtic languages, laws, and customs that are presented as historical research, rather than religious practice, but that maintain cultural knowledge more systematically than underground networks can achieve. The Christians are doing what we're doing, but with official protection and institutional resources. You observe after visiting several Celtic monasteries to assess their preservation activities. They're maintaining Celtic culture within foreign religious frameworks, just as we're maintaining it within Roman educational and administrative systems. This recognition leads to one of the network's most controversial decisions: developing working relationships with Celtic Christian communities that share interests in cultural preservation despite religious differences. The collaboration requires careful management to avoid compromising either Druidic or Christian authenticity, but it also creates unprecedented opportunities for safeguarding Celtic traditions. The partnership that develops involves Celtic Christians providing institutional protection for cultural preservation activities, while Druidic survivors contribute specialized knowledge that Christian scholars cannot access through their own resources. Monasteries become repositories for traditional legal and astronomical texts that are presented as historical documentation, while actually providing complete instruction in Druidic learning. Your own involvement in these arrangements requires adopting yet another disguise, presenting yourself as a Celtic scholar who provides historical consultation for Christian educational institutions. The role allows you to place Druidic texts in monastic libraries, where they will be preserved and copied by Christian scribes who may not fully understand their true significance. We're hiding our most sacred knowledge in churches, Lucatorix observes with bitter irony. Our ancestors would be horrified, but it may be the only way to ensure that future generations have access to traditional learning. The Christian collaboration proves remarkably successful at preserving knowledge, but it also accelerates the transformation of Druidism from a contisfer, living spiritual practice, into an academic subject. Traditional rituals and magical techniques become historical curiosities rather than active religious practices. Celtic deities become mythological figures rather than objects of worship. This development troubles network members who entered preservation work to maintain authentic spiritual connections rather than to create scholarly archives. But it also provides unprecedented security for cultural knowledge that might otherwise be lost entirely when the original generation of survivors dies. The collaboration also creates unexpected opportunities for influencing the development of Celtic Christianity in directions that preserve more traditional values. Network members who establish relationships with Christian scholars can encourage interpretations of scripture and theology that incorporate Celtic spiritual insights within Christian frameworks. Marukos proves particularly effective at this work, developing friendships with young Celtic Christians who are interested in understanding their cultural heritage. Through careful conversations that present traditional wisdom as historical knowledge, rather than competing religious truth, he introduces Christian scholars to Druidic approaches to law, nature, and spiritual practice. I'm not trying to convert them back to Druidism, he explains. I'm trying to ensure that Celtic Christianity incorporates enough traditional wisdom to maintain cultural continuity, even if religious forms change completely. His approach reflects the network's evolved understanding of cultural preservation as a process that transcends specific religious or political frameworks. The essential goal is maintaining Celtic identity and values rather than preserving particular institutional structures that may no longer be viable under changed circumstances. The Christian challenge ultimately strengthens the preservation effort by forcing greater precision about what elements of Celtic culture are truly essential versus what aspects can be modified or abandoned without destroying cultural identity. The process is painful for those who are emotionally attached to traditional forms, but it also produces more sophisticated understanding of cultural continuity principles. 25 years after Mona's destruction, the network faces its greatest test when a major Celtic rebellion erupts in northern Britain, forcing difficult choices about the relationship between cultural preservation and political resistance. The uprising, led by a coalition of tribes that have never fully accepted Roman rule, creates opportunities for Druidic influence, but also threatens the careful balance that has allowed the preservation effort to continue. The rebellion begins when Roman authorities attempt to establish a new veteran colony on tribal lands that include sacred sites important to Celtic religious tradition. The decision to build Roman settlements on the grounds of ancient Nemeda, sacred groves where Druids once taught and performed their most important ceremonies, triggers outrage that transcends normal political grievances. "They're not just taking our land," explains Cardamandua during an emergency network meeting. "They're desecrating the most sacred places of our ancestors." Even Celts who have accepted Roman rule are beginning to question whether accommodation has gone too far. The religious dimension of the conflict creates intense pressure on network members to abandon their strategy of cultural preservation through cooperation and instead openly support armed resistance. Many younger Druids argue that failing to support the rebellion would betray the spiritual responsibilities that justify their entire preservation effort. What's the point of preserving Druidic knowledge if we're not willing to defend the sacred sites where that knowledge was originally developed? Demands Dubno Valonis, who's become one of the most influential voices among the new generation of network members. The counter-argument, advanced by original survivors like yourself, emphasizes the catastrophic consequences that open involvement in rebellion would bring for the entire preservation effort. Roman authorities already suspect that Druidic networks coordinate resistance activities. Direct participation in armed rebellion would confirm these suspicions and trigger persecution that would destroy decades of careful work. We've spent 25 years proving that we can preserve Celtic culture without threatening Roman political control, you argue during increasingly heated network discussions. If we join this rebellion, we'll be admitting that our entire approach was deceptive, and we'll face the same persecution that destroyed the original Druidic schools, the internal. Debate reflects fundamental tensions about the purpose and scope of cultural preservation that have been building for years. Is the network's responsibility limited to maintaining knowledge and traditions? Or does it extend to defending the physical sites and political structures that give those traditions meaning? Can cultural preservation be separated from political resistance when imperial policies directly threaten cultural survival? The urgency of these questions intensifies when rebellion leaders specifically request Druidic support. Traditional Celtic warfare relied heavily on spiritual leadership from Druids, who provided both tactical advice and supernatural protection. The rebels believed that Druidic participation would significantly improve their chances of success while also demonstrating that Celtic spiritual traditions remain vital forces rather than merely historical curiosities. They need more than our knowledge, reports Ambiorix after meeting with rebellion commanders. They need the legitimacy that Druidic blessing would provide. Half their warriors are Christians or Romanized Celts, who won't fight effectively unless they believe the gods support their cause. The recognition that the rebellion's success might depend on Druidic involvement creates a profound moral dilemma. For network members, refusing to support legitimate resistance to cultural oppression seems like a betrayal of everything Druidism represents. But participating in a rebellion that is likely to fail would sacrifice the preservation work that has already achieved so much. The solution that emerges represents a complex compromise that attempts to serve both preservation and resistance needs. The network decides to provide limited, indirect support for the rebellion while maintaining official neutrality that preserves the security of the broader preservation effort. Selected network members with military experience volunteer to serve as individual advisors to rebellion commanders, but they present themselves as Celtic warriors rather than Druidic representatives. Traditional knowledge about strategy, logistics, and morale that derives from Druidic training is shared with rebel leaders, but it's presented as historical research rather than current spiritual guidance. Most importantly, The network begins working to preserve portable cultural artifacts and knowledge repositories that might be destroyed if the rebellion fails and triggers renewed Roman persecution. Sacred texts, ritual implements, and genealogical records are moved to secure locations outside the rebellion zone, ensuring that cultural treasures will survive regardless of political outcomes. Your own role in these activities involves coordinating the evacuation of cultural materials while maintaining your cover as a neutral scholar who is simply concerned about protecting historical artifacts from potential war damage. The work allows you to support cultural preservation while avoiding direct involvement in political resistance. The rebellion itself unfolds with the tragic inevitability that experienced observers anticipated. Initial Celtic victories achieved through surprise and superior knowledge of local terrain create false hopes for ultimate success, but Roman military superiority in organization, equipment, and resources gradually reasserts itself as the imperial response develops. The suppression of the rebellion is swift and brutal. Celtic warriors who fight with traditional weapons and tactics cannot match the disciplined effectiveness of Roman legions equipped with superior technology and supported by auxiliary troops. Drawn from throughout the empire, the rebellion collapses within 6 months, leaving thousands dead and entire tribal territories devastated. The aftermath brings exactly the kind of increased scrutiny and persecution that network conservatives had predicted. Roman authorities launched comprehensive investigations into the sources of rebellion support, paying particular attention to possible Druidic involvement. Several network members are arrested and interrogated, though most maintain their cover identities successfully enough to avoid serious charges. The crackdown forces temporary suspension of most network activities, while members assess the damage and develop new security protocols. Communication networks are reorganized, meeting places are abandoned, and several key operatives are relocated to regions where they're less likely to attract attention. But the rebellion also produces unexpected benefits for the preservation effort. The extensive documentation of Celtic military traditions, tribal leadership structures, and religious practices that network members compiled during the conflict provides invaluable historical records that will serve future scholars. The cultural materials evacuated during the rebellion are successfully preserved and eventually find their way into secure repositories where they can be maintained indefinitely. Most importantly, the rebellion demonstrates both the continued vitality of Celtic resistance and the superior survival value of the preservation network's approach. Armed resistance fails catastrophically, while cultural preservation work continues despite increased difficulties. The contrast validates the strategy of maintaining traditions through accommodation rather than confrontation. 30 years after the burning of Mona, the network's long-term strategy of patient cultural preservation receives unexpected validation when the Roman Empire enters a period of severe political crisis that creates new opportunities for Celtic cultural revival. The Year of the Four Emperors sees imperial authority collapse and civil war rage throughout the provinces, fundamentally altering the balance of power between Romans and subject peoples. The crisis begins with the suicide of Nero and the subsequent struggle for imperial succession that pits rival claimants against each other in bloody conflicts that devastate Roman military resources. As legions are withdrawn from Britain to fight in civil wars on the continent, imperial control over Celtic territories weakens dramatically. The eagles are flying away, reports Vercassivilis from his position in the provincial administration. Half the garrison troops have been transferred to support Vespasian's bid for the purple, and the remaining commanders are more concerned about protecting their own positions than enforcing cultural policies. The weakening of Roman authority creates space for activities that would have been impossible during periods of strong imperial control. Celtic communities begin openly practicing traditional customs that have been suppressed or driven underground. Sacred sites that were converted to Roman use are quietly reclaimed for Celtic ceremonies. Languages and dialects that were discouraged in favor of Latin experience a revival in both private and public use. The network responds to these opportunities by carefully expanding its activities while maintaining the security protocols that have ensured survival through decades of persecution. The goal is to take advantage of imperial weakness without triggering a backlash when Roman authority inevitably reasserts itself. Your own role in this expansion involves traveling throughout Britain to re-establish contact with Celtic communities that have maintained traditional loyalties despite Roman occupation. The work requires delicate diplomacy because many tribal leaders are suspicious of anyone with Roman connections, while others are reluctant to risk their accommodated status by engaging in activities that might be construed as seditious. We're offering cultural revival, not political rebellion. You explain to gatherings of tribal elders who are considering whether to support network activities. Our goal is to strengthen Celtic identity within whatever political framework emerges. From current conflicts, not to overthrow Roman rule entirely. The distinction proves crucial for gaining support from Celtic leaders who have learned to balance traditional loyalties with practical necessities. They want to preserve their cultural heritage, but they also understand that armed resistance against Roman power has consistently failed. The network's approach of cultural preservation through legal means offers a way to strengthen Celtic identity without repeating the catastrophic mistakes of previous rebellions. The cultural revival that develops during the imperial crisis takes forms that would have been unthinkable during periods of strong Roman control. Traditional festivals are celebrated openly in communities throughout the Celtic territories. Druidic legal procedures are used to resolve disputes that Roman courts are too disrupted to handle effectively. Ancient genealogies and tribal histories are recited publicly for the first time in decades. Most significantly, young people begin showing serious interest in learning Celtic traditions that they had previously dismissed as irrelevant to their Roman-influenced lives. The imperial crisis has demonstrated the fragility of Roman civilization and the continued importance of local cultural resources for maintaining community identity during periods of instability. The network's hidden schools experience unprecedented demand for instruction in Celtic law, language, and customs. Students who previously focused exclusively on classical learning now want to understand their traditional heritage as well. The increased interest allows for more systematic teaching of Druidic knowledge that has been possible since the original persecution began. We're training more Druids now than at any time since the burning of Mona, reports Bellevicis from the Aquisules Academy. The students come from different backgrounds and approach the knowledge differently than previous generations, but their commitment to preserving Celtic culture is genuine and sophisticated. The expansion of educational activities requires careful balance between meeting increased demand and maintaining security against the possibility that Roman authority might return with renewed strength. The network develops new protocols for rapidly scaling back activities if political circumstances change, while also positioning itself to take maximum advantage of opportunities for cultural influence. The imperial crisis also creates opportunities for network members to assume positions of greater influence within British society. As Roman officials flee or are recalled to participate in civil wars, local leadership roles become available. The people with the skills and knowledge necessary for maintaining order and providing essential services. Maroukos exemplifies this development by accepting appointment as a legal arbitrator in his home territory. His knowledge of both Roman and Celtic law makes him valuable for resolving disputes between communities with different legal traditions, while his tribal connections give him credibility with Celtic populations that might reject purely Roman authority. I'm practicing as a Druidic judge for the first time in my life, he reports with satisfaction. The legal principles I learned through network training are finally being applied to real cases, involving real people rather than being preserved as historical curiosities. Similar opportunities develop throughout the Celtic territories as network. Members emerge from hiding to provide leadership that combines traditional knowledge with practical administrative skills. The process demonstrates the value of the long-term preservation strategy while also validating the network's emphasis on adaptation rather than pure resistance. But the opportunities also create new risks as increased visibility makes network members more vulnerable to future persecution if Roman authority reasserts itself. The balance between taking advantage of current opportunities and maintaining long-term security requires constant adjustment as political circumstances continue to evolve. The imperial crisis ultimately lasts longer than anyone initially expected, providing nearly 5 years of reduced Roman pressure on Celtic cultural activities. By the time Vespasian establishes stable imperial authority, the network has succeeded in achieving a significant revival of Celtic traditions that cannot be easily reversed, even when Roman control is restored. When imperial authority stabilizes under the Flavian dynasty, the network discovers that the cultural revival achieved during the crisis years has created a fundamentally different relationship between Celtic traditions and Roman governance. Instead of simple suppression or grudging tolerance, the new imperial administration adopts policies that actively encourage certain forms of Celtic cultural expression as a means of maintaining provincial stability. The change reflects practical lessons learned from the recurring pattern of rebellion and suppression that has characterized Romano-Celtic relations since the conquest began. Imperial administrators have concluded that attempts to completely erase Celtic culture generate more resistance than they prevent, while strategic accommodation of traditional practices can actually strengthen Roman control by providing channels for local identity that don't threaten imperial authority. They're trying to domesticate us, observes Lugotarix during a network assessment meeting. Instead of stamping out Celtic culture, they want to turn it into harmless folklore that makes people feel connected to their heritage without inspiring actual resistance to Roman rule. The new imperial approach presents both opportunities and dangers for the preservation network. Opportunities, because officially sanctioned cultural activities provide better cover for more sensitive preservation work. Dangers, because imperial manipulation of Celtic traditions could corrupt or trivialize the authentic knowledge that the network has worked so hard to maintain. Vespasian's administration implements policies that encourage Celtic cultural expression within carefully defined limits. Traditional festivals are permitted as long as they don't interfere with Roman religious observances or administrative requirements. Celtic languages are tolerated in local contexts, while Latin remains mandatory for official business. Traditional crafts and artistic styles are actively promoted as distinctive British contributions to imperial culture. Most significantly for the network's work, Celtic legal traditions are formally recognized as valid for resolving disputes between tribal members, provided that the decisions don't conflict with Roman law and that serious crimes remain under imperial jurisdiction. This policy creates legitimate opportunities for practicing Druidic jurisprudence that haven't existed since the original conquest. Your own experience of this new environment involves being recruited by Roman officials to serve as an expert consultant on Celtic legal traditions. The appointment requires careful navigation between providing useful information to imperial administrators and protecting the more sensitive aspects of Druidic knowledge from exploitation or corruption. We need people who understand both systems, explains the provincial governor when he offers you the consulting position. Celtic communities respect traditional procedures, but they also need to understand how those procedures fit within imperial legal frameworks. Your expertise could help us avoid conflicts that waste everyone's time and energy. The work involves translating Celtic legal concepts into Roman terminology, advising imperial judges on the cultural context of tribal disputes, and helping to develop procedures that satisfy both Celtic expectations and Roman administrative requirements. It's exactly the kind of cultural bridge building that the network has been preparing for through decades of preservation work. But the consulting role also requires compromises that trouble some network members who fear that official recognition might lead to fundamental corruption of authentic traditions. Working within Roman legal frameworks inevitably changes the character of Celtic law, even when the changes are intended to preserve traditional principles. We're not practicing real Druidic law, argues Senbeck during network discussions about the implications of official collaboration. We're practicing a Romanized version that uses Celtic terminology but operates according to imperial assumptions about legal authority and procedure. The criticism has merit, but it also reflects the ongoing tension within the network between purist preservation and pragmatic adaptation. The choice is not between authentic Druidism and corrupted collaboration, but between modified preservation and complete extinction under current circumstances. Perfectly authentic practice is impossible regardless of what strategic choices the network makes. The new equilibrium ultimately proves more favorable to Celtic cultural preservation than anyone in the network had dared to hope. Official recognition provides legitimacy and resources for educational activities that can now operate openly rather than in secret. The hidden schools evolve into recognized institutions that offer instruction in Celtic traditions alongside classical subjects. The Aquisules Academy receives official designation as a provincial institute for British cultural studies, with imperial funding for research into tribal customs and historical traditions. Balvasis becomes the institute's first director, overseeing a curriculum that provides systematic instruction in Celtic law, language, astronomy, and healing within a Roman educational framework. We're doing the same work we've always done, he reports. But now we have official support instead of official persecution. The knowledge being transmitted is essentially unchanged, but the context makes it accessible to students who would never have risked involvement with an underground network. Similar developments occur throughout the Celtic territories as the imperial administration actively supports cultural institutions that preserve traditional knowledge within acceptable political frameworks. The network's long-term strategy of positioning members throughout Roman society proves crucial for taking advantage of these opportunities. Network members who have established themselves as experts in Celtic culture receive appointments to administrative positions that allow them to influence policy development. Others gain access to resources for documenting and preserving traditional knowledge through officially sanctioned research projects. The combination of influence and resources creates unprecedented possibilities for systematic cultural preservation. The transformation is remarkable enough to vindicate the network's controversial strategy of accommodation rather than resistance. After 35 years of patient work under impossible conditions, the preservation effort has achieved an outcome that pure resistance could never have accomplished: official recognition and support for maintaining Celtic traditions within the imperial system. But success also creates new challenges as the network must adapt to circumstances that no one anticipated when the preservation effort began. Official recognition brings scrutiny and expectations that underground operations never faced. The need to satisfy imperial requirements while maintaining authentic traditional content requires constant negotiation and compromise. Most fundamentally, success raises questions about the ultimate purpose of the preservation effort. Is the goal simply to maintain Celtic knowledge and traditions in any form that ensures survival? Or is there some essential characteristic of Druidism that cannot be preserved within Roman institutional frameworks, regardless of how accommodating imperial policies become? These questions will shape the next phase of the network's development as cultural Preservation transitions from emergency survival work to ongoing institutional management within the imperial system. 40 years after the burning of Mona, you find yourself in the extraordinary position of serving as the senior instructor at an imperially funded institute, devoted to preserving and teaching the very Celtic traditions that Roman armies once tried to exterminate. The transformation seems almost miraculous, but it also forces constant reflection on the relationship between survival and authenticity in cultural preservation. The Institute operates in facilities that would have been unimaginable to traditional Druids. Stone buildings with heated rooms. Extensive libraries containing both classical and Celtic texts, and workshops equipped with the finest tools for preserving and copying ancient manuscripts. The resources available for cultural preservation work exceed anything that existed even during the height of pre-conquest Celtic civilization. Your students represent a new generation of Celts who approach their traditional heritage from perspectives that combine classical education with genuine appreciation for indigenous wisdom. They are as comfortable reading Latin poetry as reciting Celtic genealogies, as skilled in Roman rhetoric as in traditional Celtic oratory. Their synthetic approach to learning creates possibilities for cultural development that pure traditionalists could never have achieved. We're not trying to recreate the past, explains Cunetta, one of your most promising students who's gone on to establish similar institutes in other provinces. We're trying to create a future where Celtic wisdom contributes to imperial civilization, instead of being destroyed by it. His perspective reflects the philosophical evolution that has occurred within the preservation network as it adapted to changing circumstances. The original goal of maintaining traditional Druidism unchanged has given way to more complex objectives that involve enriching imperial culture through Celtic contributions, while ensuring that essential Celtic values survive in modified forms. The curriculum you have developed over decades of teaching combines traditional Druidic subjects with classical learning in ways that demonstrate the intellectual sophistication of Celtic traditions. Students learn Celtic law not as an alternative to Roman jurisprudence, but as a complementary system that offers valuable insights into community justice and conflict resolution. Astronomical instruction emphasizes the practical applications of Celtic calendar systems while also providing training in classical mathematical techniques. The combination produces students who can contribute to imperial engineering and navigation projects while maintaining understanding of traditional Celtic approaches to understanding natural cycles. Healing practices receive particular attention because of their obvious practical value for imperial administrators who need effective medical care in provincial settings. Celtic medical knowledge proves especially valuable for treating conditions that classical medicine handles poorly, creating opportunities for genuine intellectual exchange rather than simple cultural preservation. The Romans are learning from us as much as we're learning from them. You observed during a faculty meeting at the Institute. The intellectual synthesis that's developing benefits both traditions while creating something new that's more sophisticated than either could achieve. Independently, the development of this synthetic approach to learning represents perhaps the most important achievement of the preservation network. Instead of simply maintaining Celtic traditions as historical curiosities, the work has demonstrated their continuing relevance for addressing contemporary challenges. Celtic knowledge contributes to imperial administration, engineering, medicine, and law in ways that make it genuinely valuable rather than merely tolerated. But the synthetic approach also raises ongoing questions about cultural authenticity that become more complex as the adaptation process continues. Students who learn Celtic traditions within Roman institutional frameworks inevitably understand them differently than Druids who receive traditional forest-based education. The content may be similar, but the consciousness is necessarily different. Sometimes, I wonder whether we're training Druids or training Romans who happen to know about Druidism. You confide to Marukos during one of your periodic evaluations of the Institute's effectiveness. The knowledge is being transmitted accurately, but the spiritual relationship to that knowledge may be fundamentally different. His response reflects the pragmatic wisdom that has emerged from 4 decades of preservation work. Maybe that's the best we can achieve under current circumstances. The essential knowledge survives, and future generations can develop whatever spiritual relationships to it their circumstances permit. Our responsibility is to ensure that the knowledge remains available, not to control how it's used. The Institutes. Success has also created opportunities for influencing the broader development of Romano-Celtic culture throughout the empire. Students who complete their training carry their knowledge to positions throughout the imperial administration, where they can apply Celtic insights to practical problems, while also serving as advocates for continued cultural preservation. Your former students now serve as provincial administrators in Gaul, legal advisors in Hispania, and educational consultants in frontier regions where imperial authority is still being established. Their work demonstrates the practical value of Celtic knowledge, while also ensuring that traditional wisdom influences imperial policy development. We've achieved something that armed resistance could never have accomplished. You reflect during the Institute's 10th anniversary celebration. Celtic ideas are shaping imperial civilization from within. Not by conquest, but by contribution. The long-term impact of this intellectual influence may prove more significant than traditional forms of political resistance. Ideas have a way of spreading and evolving that transcends the particular institutional frameworks within which they originate. Celtic approaches to law, community organization, and environmental management may continue influencing imperial culture long after the current political arrangements change. The preservation network has also created institutional structures that can survive individual personalities and political fluctuations. The network of institutes, libraries, and research centers that has developed provides multiple repositories for Celtic knowledge that are integrated enough to provide mutual support, but independent enough to survive local disasters. We've built something more resilient than the original Druidic schools, observes Balavisis as he prepares for retirement from active teaching. The traditional system was concentrated in a few locations that could be destroyed by targeted attacks. Our distributed network can adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining continuity of knowledge transmission. As you approach the end of your own teaching career, you recognize that the preservation effort has succeeded beyond any reasonable expectations, while also transforming into something that would be unrecognizable to the Druids who perished at Mona. The essential knowledge has survived, the cultural values have been transmitted, and the intellectual traditions continue to develop and contribute to human understanding. But the forms through which these achievements have been realized represent fundamental adaptations that raise ongoing questions about the relationship between cultural survival and cultural change. Perhaps that tension is inevitable in any preservation effort that succeeds over multiple generations under changing circumstances. 50 years after the sacred grove burned, you stand once again on the island of Mona, but the landscape that surrounds you bears little resemblance to the place where your druidic education began, where ancient oaks once sheltered sacred groves. Carefully planned gardens now display specimens from throughout the empire, where Druids once taught the ancient laws under starlight. Roman architects have constructed a magnificent academy that serves students from across the Celtic world. The irony is profound and complex. The site that witnessed the near extinction of Druidic tradition has become the headquarters for its most successful preservation effort. The trees may be different, the buildings may be Roman, and the students may read Latin as fluently as Celtic languages. But the essential work of transmitting ancient wisdom continues in forms that have adapted to survive imperial rule. The Academy of Mona, as it's now officially known, represents the culmination of 5 decades of patient cultural preservation work, funded by imperial grants and staffed by scholars who combine traditional Celtic knowledge with classical learning. It provides the most comprehensive education in Celtic traditions available anywhere in the Roman world. Your role as Senior Fellow for Celtic Studies gives you responsibility for overseeing the transmission of knowledge that you help preserve through the darkest years of persecution. The work involves training new generations of teachers who will carry Celtic learning to institutes throughout the empire, while ensuring that the essential content remains authentic despite continued adaptation to Roman institutional requirements. We've completed the circle, observes Marukos as you walk together through gardens where the original sacred grove once stood. The knowledge that began here was driven underground by Roman persecution and survived through decades of hiding. An adaptation has returned to its source transformed but intact. The transformation is evident in every aspect of the Academy's operations. Students study Celtic law as part of comprehensive legal education that includes Roman jurisprudence and classical rhetoric. Celtic astronomy is taught as applied mathematics that prepares graduates for careers in engineering and administration. Celtic healing traditions are preserved within medical curricula that combine traditional knowledge with classical theoretical frameworks. The spiritual dimensions of Druidic tradition receive more complex treatment that reflects both official sensitivities and genuine theological development. Celtic religious practices are studied as anthropological and historical subjects that provide insights into the development of human consciousness and social organization. The knowledge is preserved and transmitted, but its active practice is left to individual choice within whatever religious frameworks students personally prefer. We teach the techniques but not the theology. You explain to visiting imperial officials who want to ensure that the Academy's work doesn't encourage religious practices that might compete with official cults. Students learn how Druids approach divination, healing, and spiritual development, but they apply that knowledge within whatever religious traditions they personally follow. The approach satisfies official requirements while actually preserving more authentic spiritual knowledge than anyone initially expected would be possible. Students who are genuinely interested in traditional Celtic spirituality can develop their own practices based on authentic knowledge, while those who prefer Roman or Christian religious frameworks can still benefit from Celtic insights into healing, divination, and natural philosophy. The Academy's library has become the most important repository of Celtic knowledge in the Empire, containing texts that preserve not just British traditions, but also materials gathered from Druidic survivors. Throughout the Celtic world, the collection includes legal codes, astronomical calculations, genealogical records, medical formulae, and religious poetry that represents the accumulated wisdom of centuries. We've assembled the complete corpus of Druidic learning in written form for the first time in history, reports the chief librarian during your monthly review of preservation. Activities. Traditional Druids relied entirely on oral transmission, but our written records ensure that knowledge can be preserved indefinitely, regardless of what happens to individual teachers or institutions. The written preservation represents both a triumph and a transformation that fundamentally changes the character of Celtic learning. Traditional oral transmission required personal relationships between teachers and students that ensured not just factual knowledge, but also cultural consciousness and spiritual discipline. Written texts preserve information but cannot transmit the experiential knowledge that was equally important in traditional Druidic education. But written preservation also creates possibilities for knowledge transmission that oral tradition could never achieve. Texts can be copied, translated, and distributed to scholars throughout the empire who would never have had access to traditional Druidic teachers. The knowledge becomes available to anyone with literacy and intellectual curiosity, rather than being limited to individuals who could dedicate decades to specialized apprenticeship. Your own contribution to this written preservation involves compiling comprehensive texts that combine traditional knowledge with explanatory materials, designed to help non-Celtic readers understand the cultural context and practical applications of Druidic learning. The work requires constant balance between preserving authentic content and making it accessible to audiences who lack traditional cultural background. The most ambitious project involves creating a complete encyclopedia of Celtic knowledge that will serve as a reference work for scholars throughout the Empire. The encyclopedia will include sections on law, astronomy, medicine, history, language, and religious practice, each written by experts who combine traditional knowledge with classical learning. We're creating something that never existed before. You explain to the editorial team working on the encyclopedia project. Traditional Druids knew their specialized subjects thoroughly, but they didn't have comprehensive overview of all Druidic learning. Our encyclopedia will provide systematic access to the complete range of Celtic intellectual achievement. The project also includes preparing translations of key Celtic texts into Latin and Greek to make them accessible to scholars who cannot read Celtic languages. The translations require careful attention to preserving essential meanings while making concepts comprehensible to readers who approach the material from different cultural perspectives. As work on the encyclopedia nears completion, you recognize that it represents the final achievement of the preservation effort that began with your desperate flight from Mona 5 decades earlier. The knowledge that seemed certain to die with the burning of the sacred groves has not only survived, but has been systematically documented and made available for transmission to future generations throughout the civilized world. The success exceeds any reasonable expectations that could have been maintained during the darkest years of persecution. The network of 17 survivors that seemed so pathetically small has grown into an institutional structure that employs hundreds of scholars and teachers. The fragments of knowledge that individual survivors carried in their memories have been assembled into comprehensive educational resources that preserve Celtic learning more completely than it was ever preserved. Even during the height of traditional Druidic civilization. But the success has also required adaptations that transform the essential character of what has been preserved. The Druidism that emerges from the Academy is recognizably Celtic, but fundamentally different from the tradition that existed before. Roman conquest. The knowledge is more systematic, the teaching methods are more efficient, and the institutional support is more secure. But the spiritual consciousness and cultural immediacy of traditional practice cannot be recovered through academic study. Perhaps that loss is inevitable in any preservation effort that succeeds across multiple generations under transformed circumstances. The choice was never between maintaining Druidism unchanged and losing it entirely. The choice was between allowing it to evolve in response to new conditions and watching it disappear completely. As you enter the final years of your life, serving as the Academy's Senior Fellow Emeritus, you find yourself contemplating the strange circularity of historical processes that has brought Celtic learning back to prominence, just as the Roman Empire begins showing signs of the internal stresses that may eventually lead to its transformation or collapse. Reports from throughout the empire describe increasing pressure from barbarian tribes, economic difficulties that strain imperial resources, and political conflicts that divide imperial attention and weaken central authority. The same forces that originally brought Roman armies to Celtic territories are now challenging Roman dominance from new directions, creating conditions that may eventually provide opportunities for further Celtic cultural revival. Empires rise and fall, observes Cuneta during one of his visits to the Academy. But cultures adapt and survive. We've learned how to preserve our essential identity through imperial domination. That knowledge will serve us well regardless of what political changes lie ahead. His perspective reflects the long-term thinking that has sustained the preservation effort through decades of uncertainty, and adaptation. The network's focus has never been simply on surviving current circumstances, but on maintaining cultural resources that can support Celtic identity under whatever conditions the future might bring. The institutional structures that have been created through 5 decades of patient work provide unprecedented resilience for Celtic cultural transmission. The network of academies, libraries, and research centers operates independently of any particular political arrangement while remaining adaptable to changing circumstances. The knowledge has been preserved in multiple formats and locations that ensure continuity even if individual institutions are disrupted or destroyed. More importantly, the synthetic approach to learning that has been developed combines Celtic wisdom with classical knowledge in ways that demonstrate the continuing relevance of traditional insights for addressing universal human challenges. Instead of being merely historical curiosities, Celtic approaches to law, medicine, community organization, and spiritual development offer practical alternatives to purely Roman solutions. We've proven that our traditions aren't primitive survivals from a barbarous past. You reflect during discussions with visiting scholars from throughout the empire. They're sophisticated approaches to perennial human problems that remain valuable, regardless of technological or political circumstances. This demonstration of continuing relevance may prove more important for long-term cultural survival than the specific institutional arrangements that currently support Celtic learning. Ideas that prove their practical value tend to survive and spread regardless of the political frameworks within which they originate. Celtic insights that have been preserved and developed through the academy system may continue influencing human development long after current imperial structures have been transformed or replaced. The students who graduate from the academy system carry their knowledge to positions throughout the civilized world, where they apply Celtic insights to practical problems while also serving as advocates for continued cultural development. Their work creates expanding networks of influence that extend far beyond the Celtic territories where the preservation effort began. Some graduates establish new educational institutions in regions where Celtic learning was previously unknown. Others use their knowledge to inform policy development in areas ranging from legal reform to agricultural improvement. Still others pursue scholarly research that develops Celtic intellectual traditions in directions that traditional Druids could never have anticipated. We're not just preserving the past, explains one of your former students who now serves as an advisor to provincial governors throughout Gaul. We're creating new possibilities for the future by demonstrating how traditional wisdom can address contemporary challenges. The expanding influence of Celtic learning creates positive feedback loops that strengthen the institutional structures, supporting cultural preservation while also generating resources for further development. Imperial administrators who benefit from Celtic insights become advocates for continued support of the academy system. Scholars who discover valuable knowledge in Celtic traditions contribute their own expertise to preservation efforts. The integration of Celtic and classical learning also produces intellectual innovations that enrich both traditions while creating synthetic approaches that are more sophisticated than either could achieve independently. Students trained and combined curricula develop perspectives and capabilities that neither traditional Druids nor classical scholars possessed. As your own final years approach, you recognize that the preservation effort has achieved something more significant than simple cultural survival. It has demonstrated the possibility of maintaining authentic traditional identity while adapting successfully to radically transformed circumstances. The knowledge has been preserved, the values have been transmitted, and the intellectual traditions continue to develop and contribute to human understanding. The path from the burning grove of Mona to the flourishing academy has required compromises and adaptations that would have been unimaginable to traditional Druids. But it has also preserved essential elements of Celtic civilization that would have been lost entirely if adaptation had not been attempted. We bend, but we do not break. You murmur, recalling Cathbad's final words to you 50 years ago. The tree that yields to the storm survives to grow again in calm weather. The storm of conquest and persecution has passed, leaving Celtic culture transformed but intact. The institutional foundations have been laid for continued development. Under whatever circumstances the future may bring, the knowledge has been preserved in forms that ensure transmission to future generations, regardless of political changes. Most importantly, the preservation effort has demonstrated that cultural survival is possible, even under the most adverse circumstances when people are willing to think strategically, adapt creatively, and persist through decades of patient work. The lesson applies not just to Celtic culture, but to any tradition that faces existential threats from dominant civilizations. As you sit in the academy garden where the sacred grove once stood, watching young scholars study texts that preserve the wisdom of ancient Druids, you understand that you have lived to see something unprecedented in human history: the successful preservation and institutional revival of a culture that seemed destined for extinction. The circle is complete, but it is also a spiral that ascends to new levels of possibility. Celtic learning has returned to Mona not as a nostalgic recreation of the past, but as a living tradition that continues to evolve and contribute to human understanding. The sacred grove burns no more, but the flame of wisdom it once sheltered burns brighter than ever in the minds of students, who carry that light into an uncertain but promising future. 60 years have passed since that morning. When Roman torches first touched the sacred oaks of Mona, you are gone now, having lived to see the impossible dream fulfilled. The restoration of Celtic learning to its ancient home, transformed yet authentic, adapted yet true to its essential spirit. Your legacy lives on in the thousands of students who learned from your teaching, the dozens of institutions that grew from your preservation work, and the countless texts that preserve your systematic documentation of Druidic knowledge. But perhaps most importantly, your legacy lives in the demonstration that cultural traditions can survive even the most complete destruction. When people are willing to think beyond traditional boundaries and work with patient determination across generations. The Academy of Mona stands now as more than an educational institution. It has become a symbol of cultural resilience and a model for preservation efforts throughout the civilized world. When other indigenous traditions face extinction under imperial pressure, scholars and activists look to the Celtic example for strategies that might allow adaptation without destruction. The network that began with 17 desperate survivors has evolved into an international community of institutions dedicated to preserving and developing indigenous knowledge systems. The techniques developed for hiding Druidic learning within Roman educational frameworks have been adapted for protecting other traditions threatened by dominant civilizations. The written corpus of Celtic knowledge compiled through decades of preservation work has become one of the treasures of classical learning, studied by scholars throughout the empire who recognize its intellectual sophistication and practical value. Celtic law influences legal development in multiple provinces. Celtic medical knowledge contributes to therapeutic advances throughout the Roman world. Celtic approaches to astronomy and mathematics inform engineering projects across the empire. But beyond its practical contributions, the preservation of Celtic learning has enriched human civilization by demonstrating the value of cultural diversity and the importance of maintaining multiple approaches to understanding reality, the synthetic tradition that emerged from combining Celtic and classical knowledge shows what can be achieved when different intellectual traditions engage in genuine dialogue rather than mutual destruction. Students at the Academy of Mona learn not just about Celtic traditions, but about the broader principles of cultural preservation and development. They study how traditions adapt to survive changing circumstances, how knowledge can be transmitted across cultural boundaries, and how ancient wisdom can address contemporary challenges. The curriculum includes courses on preservation methodology that train students to work with threatened traditions throughout the empire. Graduates carry their knowledge to positions where they can help other indigenous communities develop strategies for maintaining their cultural identity under imperial rule. The preservation techniques developed through 5 decades of network operations have been systematized into educational resources that are available to anyone facing similar challenges. The lessons learned about adaptation, security, and long-term planning provide guidance for cultural preservation efforts in contexts far removed from the original Celtic circumstances. As new generations of scholars study the Celtic preservation story, they extract principles that apply to their own situations, while also gaining inspiration from an example of successful resistance to cultural extinction. The story demonstrates that determination, creativity, and strategic thinking can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles when people are willing to work together across decades and generations. The sacred grove of Mona burns no more, but its spirit lives on in forms that ancient Druids could never have anticipated. The wisdom that once was transmitted only in forest clearings to carefully selected apprentices now reaches students throughout the civilized world through books, lectures, and institutional curricula. The knowledge has been democratized, made accessible to anyone with literacy and curiosity, rather than being restricted to a hereditary priesthood with exclusive control over cultural transmission. The change represents both loss and gain. Loss of the mystical authority that came with exclusive knowledge, but gain in the broader influence that comes from widespread accessibility. In the Academy Gardens where the original sacred oaks once stood, new trees grow, species from throughout the empire that symbolize the international character of the learning that now takes place here. Celtic wisdom mingles with insights from Egypt, Greece, Persia, and Germania in an intellectual synthesis that enriches all traditions while diminishing none. Students who walk these paths carry the knowledge forward into careers that span the empire and beyond. Some become teachers who establish new institutions in frontier regions. Others become administrators who apply Celtic insights to governance challenges. Still others become scholars who continue developing the intellectual traditions that preservation made possible. The network that once consisted of desperate survivors hiding their knowledge from persecution has become an openly acknowledged community of scholars and teachers whose work enjoys imperial support and recognition. The transformation demonstrates what patience and strategic thinking can achieve when people refuse to accept that cultural destruction is inevitable. But perhaps the most important legacy of the preservation effort lies not in its institutional achievements, but in its demonstration of human resilience and creativity. When everything seemed lost, when tradition appeared doomed to extinction, ordinary people found ways to preserve what mattered most while adapting to circumstances that no one could have anticipated. The story that began with the burning of the burning of the burning of the burning of the the story that began with the burning of the sacred grove ends with the flourishing of an academy that preserves and develops the very traditions that seemed destined for extinction. It is a story of cultural death and resurrection, of adaptation and persistence, of the triumph of human wisdom over the forces of destruction. As evening settles over Mona and the Academy prepares for another night of study and contemplation, the whisper of leaves in the garden trees carries echoes of ancient voices. Druids who died for their knowledge, students who learned in secret, teachers who preserved wisdom through decades of danger. Their sacrifice made possible the transmission of learning that continues to enrich human understanding and demonstrate the eternal value of cultural diversity. The sacred grove burns no more, but the flame of wisdom it once sheltered burns eternal in the minds and hearts of those who carry forward the ancient knowledge into an ever-changing future. The circle is complete, the spiral ascends, and the whisper of leaves speaks still of mysteries that death cannot destroy and empires cannot silence.